Here is the story you were taught. Alexander the Great conquered the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to the borders of India. Then, at just 32 years old, he died suddenly in Babylon, and because he left no heir, his empire fell apart. The end. A neat, tragic tale of a young genius who flew too high and left nothing behind. It is one of the most repeated explanations in all of history. And if you stop and actually think about it for 10 seconds, it explains almost nothing. Because empires survive the deaths of their rulers all the time. That is, in fact, what makes them empires rather than personal adventures. The Roman Empire lost founders, emperors, and entire dynasties to assassination, disease, and civil war, and kept going for centuries. The Persian Empire that Alexander himself destroyed had already outlived a dozen kings. The Ottoman Empire survived mad sultans, child sultans, and murdered sultans for 600 years. Rulers die. Strong empires absorb the shock, install a successor, and carry on. So the real question is not why Alexander's empire eventually changed hands. It is why it shattered almost the instant he stopped breathing. Why the greatest empire on earth came apart within a single generation of the man who built it, and never, ever came back together. That is not normal. That demands a real explanation, and the one in the textbook, "He had no heir," is not an explanation at all. It is a description of the symptom. The true reasons are deeper and they are darker, and your textbook leaves them out because they are uncomfortable and complicated and do not fit in a single sentence. The first is that Alexander never actually built an empire in the way we imagine. He built a conquest, a vast, brilliant, blood-soaked military campaign that never had time to become a country, held together by nothing more durable than his own person. The second is that the one thing that could have saved it, a plan for what came after him, did not exist, because Alexander seems never to have seriously made one. And the third, the one that is almost never told, is the most chilling of all. His empire did not simply drift apart after his death. It was deliberately torn to pieces, and its royal family hunted down and murdered, one by the very men he trusted most, because a divided empire was worth more to them than a united one. Alexander's empire did not collapse, it was cannibalized, and to understand how, you have to see what it actually was on the day he died, which was far less than the word empire suggests. We use the word empire and picture something solid. Provinces, laws, a capital, a bureaucracy, roads, a shared sense of belonging to one great state. When we say the Roman Empire, we mean a machine that ran, more or less, whether or not any particular emperor was competent. Alexander's empire was almost none of these things. It was something far more fragile, and understanding that fragility is the first thing the textbook skips. Consider how it was made. Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 before Christ and spent essentially the entire rest of his life at war. In roughly a decade of near-continuous campaigning, he smashed the Persian Empire, marched through Egypt, drove deep into Central Asia, and pushed all the way to the rivers of what is now Pakistan, before his exhausted army finally refused to go any farther. It is one of the most staggering military achievements in human history. But notice what he was doing the entire time. He was conquering. He was almost never governing. An empire that size needs to be built as well as won, and building takes time and attention that Alexander never gave it. He did not stop to construct a unified system of administration across his conquests. For the most part, he simply took over the machinery that was already there, keeping the old Persian provincial structure, leaving local governors and local elites in place to run things, as long as the taxes and the soldiers kept flowing to him. There was no common law binding a Greek, an Egyptian, a Babylonian, and a Bactrian into a single people. There was no shared citizenship, no unifying institution, no deep loyalty to an idea of the empire itself. The conquered peoples had been beaten, not integrated. They obeyed because a genius with the finest army in the world was standing on their necks. That is the crucial point. The only thing actually holding this enormous, diverse, freshly conquered patchwork together was Alexander himself, his personal prestige, his unbroken record of victory, the almost superhuman aura he cultivated, and the raw fear of what he would do to anyone who defied him. He was not the head of the state. He was the state. The empire was less a structure than a force of personality wearing a crown, and it extended exactly as far as his reputation and his army could reach. Think about what that means for its survival. In a real institutional empire, the ruler is a replaceable part. If he dies, the institutions keep the machine running while a successor is found. In Alexander's empire, there were no such institutions to keep running. He had built no engine that could operate without him. He was the load-bearing wall, the foundation, and the roof all at once. Remove him, and there was simply nothing underneath to hold the structure up. Even his famous city founding fits this pattern rather than contradicting it. Alexander scattered new cities across his conquests, many of them named Alexandria after himself, the greatest becoming the jewel of Egypt. But these were not the seeds of a unified administration, knitting the empire into one. They were mostly military colonies and garrison towns, planted to hold down territory and settle his veterans, islands of Greek soldiers in a sea of conquered peoples. He never even settled on a true imperial capital. Babylon served as a center almost by default. The empire had no head, no nervous system, no shared civic body, only its cities like forts, its provinces like leftovers of the Persian system, and its king riding endlessly from one campaign to the next. This is why the comparison to Rome or Persia is so misleading, and why the textbook's shrug of "he had no heir" misses the real disaster. The problem was not merely that no single person was ready to replace Alexander. The problem was that no thing existed to be inherited in the first place. No functioning state that a successor could simply take the reins of. There was a magnificent conquered territory, an incomparable army, a mountain of treasure, and a legend. But there was no country, and a legend, it turns out, cannot govern. Only a living man could hold this thing together, and Alexander, for all his genius, had done nothing to change that. He had, in fact, spent his final years making the one attempt at real integration he ever tried. And that attempt had nearly torn his own army apart before he even died. To his credit, Alexander was not blind to the problem. In the last years of his life, he made a genuine and remarkably far-sighted attempt to turn his conquest into something that could last, to fuse the victorious Macedonians and the conquered Persians into a single ruling class that might actually hold the empire together. It was a bold idea. It was also the one that revealed just how brittle the whole thing was. Alexander began to behave less like a Macedonian warlord and more like a Persian king. He adopted elements of Persian royal dress and court ceremony. He kept defeated Persian nobles in positions of power and began bringing Persians into his administration and, crucially, into his army, training tens of thousands of young Persians to fight in the Macedonian style. He experimented with Persian court rituals of deference that sat very uneasily with his Greek and Macedonian companions, who were used to treating their king as a first among equals, not a god-emperor to be bowed before. The centerpiece of this vision came in 324 before Christ, in the city of Susa, where Alexander staged one of the most extraordinary political weddings in history. In a single grand ceremony, he married a daughter of the former Persian king and had scores of his senior officers simultaneously wed high-born Persian and Iranian women, with thousands of ordinary soldiers marrying local wives as well. The symbolism was deliberate and enormous. The conquerors and the conquered, joined in blood, their children meant to be the inheritors of both worlds. A new blended aristocracy to rule a blended empire. As statecraft, it was visionary. As a read of his own men, it was dangerous, because a great many of the Macedonian veterans who had followed Alexander across the world did not share his dream of fusion. They had marched and bled and buried their friends to defeat the Persians. And now they watched their king dressing like a Persian, honoring Persian nobles, and folding Persian soldiers into the army as if the men they had conquered were their equals. To them it could feel like a betrayal, as though their victory were being handed back to the losers, and their own special status as the master race of conquerors diluted and thrown away. The strain had been showing for years, in flashes of real violence. When Alexander tried to introduce the Persian court custom of bowing low before the king, an act his own men considered fit only for grovelling before a god, his Macedonians and their Greek intellectuals balked so strongly that he was forced to abandon it. On one terrible drunken night in Central Asia, Alexander ran through and killed one of his own most loyal officers, a veteran named Clytus, in a screaming quarrel that had erupted in part over exactly these tensions, over flattery, over Persian ways, over how far the conqueror was drifting from the plain-spoken Macedonian king his men had followed. Earlier still, a conspiracy scare had led him to execute a senior officer, and then arrange the killing of that man's father, one of his most trusted old generals. The relationship between Alexander and the army that had made him was never as simple as devotion. It carried fear, suspicion, and a growing unease about what their king was becoming. That resentment boiled over in the same period at a town called Opis, where Alexander's veterans broke into open mutiny. The immediate sparks were practical, grievances over who was being sent home and how the army was being reshaped. But underneath ran the deeper anger about Persians being raised up alongside Macedonians. Alexander crushed the mutiny with a mixture of fury and theatrical reconciliation, executing ringleaders and then staging a grand public feast of unity. But the message was unmistakable. The seams of his empire ran right through his own army, between the men who had won it and the plan he had for keeping it. It is worth being honest here, because the ancient sources can exaggerate for drama, and modern historians rightly debate how deep and how universal this Macedonian resentment really was. Some of Alexander's officers embraced their Persian marriages and prospered by them. The picture was not a simple wall of Macedonian rejection. But the core fact stands, and it is the one that matters for our story. the only person with the authority, the prestige, and the sheer force of will to hold these two worlds together in a single empire, was Alexander himself. The fusion depended entirely on him. Even his one serious effort to give the empire a future beyond his own lifetime was, in the end, just another thing that only he could sustain. And then, with terrifying suddenness, he was gone. In June of 323 before Christ, in the city of Babylon, Alexander fell ill. Over about 2 weeks, a fever consumed him, until, still only 32 years old, the man who had conquered the known world was dead. The exact cause has been argued over ever since. A natural fever such as typhoid or malaria is the most likely culprit, though rumours of poison swirled almost immediately and have never entirely died. But the cause hardly matters for what followed. What matters is what he left behind, which was a void of the most dangerous kind. Alexander died without a capable heir, and the shape of that gap was almost cruel. His wife Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, was pregnant, but the child was not yet born, and no one even knew if it would be a son. His only other direct male relative in a position to inherit was his half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, a man described in the sources as intellectually or mentally disabled, incapable of actually ruling in his own right. So the choices before the most powerful men in the world were these: an unborn baby, or a half-brother who could not govern. Neither could command an army, hold a court, or inspire the fear and loyalty that had been the empire's only real glue. There is a famous story that as Alexander lay dying, he was asked to whom he left his kingdom and answered simply, "To the strongest." Whether he truly said it, or whether later writers invented the perfect line, it captured reality exactly. He left no clear instructions, no designated successor ready to step into his place, no established procedure for the transfer of power. The one thing his empire needed more than anything at that moment, a plan, was the one thing he had never bothered to build, just as he had never built the institutions that might have carried out such a plan. So into the vacuum stepped the only people who actually held power in a state made of nothing but conquest and an army: his generals. These were the diadochi, the successors, hardened, brilliant, ambitious men who had commanded Alexander's forces and shared his campaigns. Men like Perdiccas, into whose hands Alexander was said to have pressed his royal signet ring; Ptolemy, shrewd and cautious; Antigonus, the fierce, one-eyed veteran; Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Antipater and his ruthless son Cassander, back in the European heartland. Each of them commanded troops. Each of them held, or wanted to hold, a slice of the conquered world. And each of them understood a simple, brutal truth that Alexander's death had laid bare. In this empire, legitimacy was a costume, but the army was the real body. Whoever controlled soldiers controlled everything. It very nearly came apart in Babylon within days of his death. The infantry and the cavalry split at once over who should rule. The foot soldiers rallied behind the disabled half-brother, Philip, as a true-blooded Macedonian king, while the senior officers and cavalry wanted to wait for Roxana's unborn child. For a moment, the greatest army in the world stood on the edge of turning its weapons on itself, in the very room where Alexander's body still lay. A tense compromise pulled them back from the brink. Both the half-brother and, once born, the infant son would be recognized as joint kings, with the general Perdiccas ruling as regent for them both. But it was a bandage over a wound, and the officer who had led the infantry's challenge was soon purged and killed. The message was already clear. This would be settled by force, not by law. At first, then, they kept up appearances. They agreed to rule as guardians and regents on behalf of the royal house, on behalf of Alexander's half-brother, now propped up as a puppet king under the name Philip III, and on behalf of Alexander's infant son by Roxana, born shortly after his father's death and named Alexander IV. The empire would be held in trust, they said, for the rightful heirs. The territories were carved up among the generals as provinces to administer in the king's names. It was a polite fiction, and everyone involved knew it was a fiction. Two helpless royals, a puppet and a baby, sat at the theoretical summit of the greatest empire on earth, while beneath them a handful of the most dangerous men alive began, very carefully, to measure one another. The fiction could not last, and when it broke not into peaceful kingdoms, but into 40 years of war and murder. What came after Alexander's death was not a tidy division of an empire. It was a 40-year bloodbath that historians call the Wars of the Successors, a grinding, shifting, merciless series of conflicts, roughly from 323 down to 281 before Christ, in which his former generals fought one another across 3 continents for the pieces of his conquest. Alliances formed and shattered. Old comrades became mortal enemies. The magnificent army Alexander had forged was turned inward. Macedonian killing Macedonian, veteran against veteran, over the spoils of the world they had won together. But the wars between the generals are only half of what the textbook leaves out. The other half is quieter, colder, and far more damning. And it is the true reason the empire could never be put back together. Because the successors did not only fight each other, they systematically hunted down and exterminated Alexander's entire family, deliberately destroying every possible heir who might one day serve as a rallying point to reunite the empire under the old royal house. Follow the killings, because together they tell the real story. Alexander's half-brother, the puppet king Philip III, was put to death in 317, along with his fierce wife, as the factions turned on their own figureheads. Alexander's formidable mother, Olympias, who had fought viciously to protect her bloodline, was cornered and executed the following year. And then came the killings that sealed the empire's fate forever. Around 310, the general Cassander had Alexander's widow Roxana and his young son, the boy king Alexander IV, the last legitimate heir, still only a child, secretly murdered, their deaths hidden so that no one could rally to a living king. A little later, Alexander's illegitimate son, a young man named Heracles, was lured out and killed as well, snuffing out the final trace of the bloodline. Sit with the enormity of that. Within about 15 years of Alexander's death, every single member of his family who could have inherited the empire, his mother, his half-brother, both of his sons, his wife, had been deliberately murdered, almost all of them by his own former officers or their agents. This was not the random cruelty of a violent age. It was a purpose carried out with terrible logic. As long as a legitimate heir of Alexander lived, the empire had a rightful center, and any general who seized power was merely a usurper who could be overthrown in the name of the true king. But if the entire royal house were wiped out, if there was simply no legitimate heir left anywhere on earth, then there was no true king to restore, no center to reunite around, and each general could claim his own slice as a kingdom in its own right, with no higher authority above him. Murdering Alexander's children was how the successors made the division permanent. And that is exactly what happened. Once the last of the bloodline was dead, the pretense of guardianship dropped away entirely. The great generals stopped ruling in the name of vanished kings and simply crowned themselves. The most powerful of them declared themselves kings outright, and Alexander's single empire hardened through decades of further war into a handful of separate, rival Hellenistic kingdoms. Ptolemy's dynasty in Egypt, which would rule for 3 centuries down to Cleopatra, the vast Seleucid realm stretching across Asia, the Antigonid kings holding Macedonia and Greece. The map was hammered into that shape by 2 last great battles, one around 301 that broke and killed the fearsome one-eyed general who had come closest to reuniting the whole, and a final clash around 281 that left the survivors as founders of rival dynasties. Alexander had conquered a world. His generals divided it into private estates and founded their own royal houses on the graves of his children. There is a bitter irony in how those kingdoms ruled. The very fusion of cultures that had so unsettled Alexander's veterans became the ordinary method of the successor states. Ptolemy's line governed Egypt as pharaohs in the old Egyptian style, and Seleucus's heirs ruled their vast Asian territories as inheritors of the Persian kings. Alexander's idea of blending conqueror and conquered survived and even flourished, but only after his empire had been shattered into pieces, and only in the hands of the men who had murdered his family to keep those pieces apart. So return now to the question the textbook answered so lazily. Why did Alexander's empire collapse? Not because a great man happened to die young and heirless, as though it were a sad accident of biology. It collapsed because of what it truly was and what was truly done to it. It was never a real state, only a conquest, held together by one irreplaceable man, with no institutions, no integration, and no plan to outlive him. When that man died, there was nothing underneath to keep it standing. And then the ambitious warlords he left in charge, rather than preserve his dream, found it far more profitable to tear the empire apart and butcher his entire family, one relative at a time, so that it could never be whole again. That is the part your textbook leaves out. The empire of Alexander the Great did not simply fall. It was dismembered on purpose, and its royal line was hunted to extinction by the very men who had helped him build it. He created something so dependent on himself that it could not survive him, and then the people he trusted most made certain, with poison and blade and secret murder, that nothing like it would ever rise in his family's name again. The face of the conqueror is on every coin and every statue. The truth of how his empire ended is written in the quiet, deliberate killing of his children.